sleepy manuscripts. Tonight, we step into the long shadow of a crown, Queen Victoria, a life that stretched across an empire and an age. Take a slow breath. Close your eyes if you'd like. Turn on D&D mode. Dim your screen light and find a comfortable position. And let's begin. She never asked for the crown. She never planned for it. She never even truly knew it was coming. Not until the morning, a group of grave, elderly men arrived at her bedroom door before sunrise, and everything changed forever. But to understand Queen Victoria, you first need to understand the extraordinary chain of accidents, deaths, dynastic panics, and near impossible coincidences that had to occur just to bring her into existence. Without all of it, without the right people dying, the right marriages happening, the right political calculations being made, there would have been no Victoria, no Victorian age, and the most powerful empire the world had ever seen might have been led instead by someone else entirely. Perhaps someone much worse. Our story begins not with Victoria herself, but with a tragedy. On the 6th of November, 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales died in childbirth at Claremont House in Surrey. She was 21 years old. Her baby, a son, stillborn, never drew breath, and with them died in a single terrible night the most obvious line of succession in the British monarchy. Charlotte had been the only legitimate grandchild of King George III. She had been the darling of the British public, vivacious, impulsive, warm-hearted, nothing like her detested father, the Prince Regent. The whole country had invested tremendous hope in her. She was young, she was healthy, she was married to a man people actually seemed to like, the dignified, cautious Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. And after so many years of royal scandal and embarrassment, she seemed to promise a future for the monarchy that people could be proud of. And now she was dead. The reaction was extraordinary. Shops closed. People wept in the streets. It was described in newspapers and letters and journals as a national calamity, a blow from which England might never fully recover. The grief was real and deep and nationwide. But alongside the grief was something else, panic, because Charlotte's death had thrown the entire question of royal succession into chaos. George III had 7 sons, and not one of them had a single legitimate child. This was not an accident. It was the result of decades of romantic extravagance, irregular domestic arrangements, and the persistent failure of the Royal Marriages Act to produce the right kind of offspring at the right kind of time. The oldest son, the Prince Regent, was obese and debauched and living apart from his wife. His marriage had been so comprehensively wretched that even the most optimistic observer could not imagine him fathering another legitimate heir. The Duke of York, widely regarded as the only brother with anything approaching the feelings of a gentleman, was married to a Prussian princess who devoted her life to her dogs and parrots and showed no inclination toward children. The Duke of Clarence had spent many happy years in the country with the actress Mrs. Jordan, with whom he had produced a large and flourishing family. None of it legal. The Duke of Cumberland was almost certainly the most unpopular man in England, hideously disfigured and associated in the public mind with murder and worse. The Duke of Sussex had contracted 2 marriages, both declared void under the Royal Marriages Act. The Duke of Cambridge wore a yellow wig and lived in Hanover and was not very interesting. And then there was Edward, Duke of Kent. He was 50 years old, stout and vigorous, with bushy eyebrows, a carefully dyed black head, and the bearing of a man who had spent too long in the military and never quite left it behind. He had served in Gibraltar, in Canada, in the West Indies. He had been recalled from Gibraltar in 1802 for being too severe with a mutinous garrison. He spent his days in London regulating his domestic affairs with great precision, designing clocks, corresponding at enormous length with various reformers and idealists, and struggling, always struggling, with his debts. Despite an income of £24,000 a year, he was perpetually ruined. He had quarreled with most of his brothers. He had joined the political opposition, and he had been living, contentedly enough, on the continent with a French companion named Madame de Saint Laurent, whom he had known for 27 years and whom he regarded with genuine affection. Charlotte's death changed everything for the Duke of Kent. He began very quickly to make calculations. If he married, if he produced a legitimate heir, surely the nation would reward him appropriately. He had in mind the precedent of his brother, the Duke of York, who had been given a settlement of £25,000 a year on his marriage. The Duke of Kent felt he deserved at least as much. In fact, he felt the nation was already deeply in his debt. About a month after Charlotte's death, he visited Brussels and arranged to encounter the gossipy and indiscreet Mr. Creevey, through whom he intended to communicate his thoughts to the appropriate political circles in London. What followed was a conversation so extraordinary that Creevey immediately wrote it all down in delighted detail. The Duke told Creevey about his long-standing devotion to Madame de Saint Laurent. He described her goodness, her disinterestedness, her excellent family connections. He recalled the morning when she had read about the possibility of his marriage in the newspaper and had been so overcome that she had convulsed at the breakfast table, and he had thought for a dreadful moment that she was dying. He spoke of the terrible sacrifice he was being asked to make for England. He also mentioned, more than once, what he thought a fair financial settlement for this sacrifice might look like. As for the payment of my debts, he concluded serenely, I don't call them great. The nation, on the contrary, is greatly my debtor. Creevey could not contain himself. He rushed off to tell the Duke of Wellington, who was very much amused. He wrote a long account of it all to Lord Sefton, who read the letter while a surgeon was sounding his bladder to determine whether he had a kidney stone, and reportedly burst out laughing the moment the procedure was finished. But in the end, both the Duke of Kent and his brother, the Duke of Clarence, did marry. The Duke of Clarence matched himself with a daughter of the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. The Duke of Kent selected from a short list of candidates the Princess Victoria Mary Louisa of Saxe-Coburg, sister of Prince Leopold, the widower of the late Princess Charlotte. She was 32 years old, short and plump, with rosy cheeks and a cheerful disposition, gorgeously dressed in rustling silks and bright velvets. The two of them married in May of 1818 and set off across Europe in a state of somewhat pinched domesticity, the Duke inspecting every military parade he could find, while the Duchess smiled equably through it all. they were not rich. The financial settlement from Parliament had been less than the Duke had hoped, and less than he felt he deserved. He could not afford to live in England. He moved through Belgium and Germany with his pregnant wife, economizing furiously while conducting himself with the gravity of a man on a great national mission. It was in the spring of 1819, with funds barely adequate for the journey, that he made his determination absolutely clear. His child would be born in England. It was, he announced, a matter of patriotic principle. So the Duke loaded the pregnant Duchess, her daughter Feodora, from her first marriage, an assortment of maids, nurses, a collection of lapdogs, and several canaries, into a traveling carriage, climbed onto the box himself, and drove them through Germany and France. Bad roads were nothing to him. Cheap inns were nothing. The English Channel was crossed. London was reached, and at Kensington Palace, on the 24th of May, 1819, in a set of rooms provided by the authorities, a daughter was born. The child received, at the time, very little attention. There was no particular reason to foresee her destiny. The Duchess of Clarence had recently given birth to a daughter. That child had died almost at once, but the Duchess was young and would certainly try again. And the Duke of Kent was vigorous, and his wife was proven fertile. Surely a son would follow to push this daughter aside. There were prophecies, though. A gypsy at Gibraltar had once told the Duke that he would have many losses and crosses in life, that he would die in happiness, and that his only child would be a great queen. The Duke believed in the prophecy. He christened his daughter Alexandrina Victoria, Alexandrina for the Tsar of Russia, one of the godfathers, Victoria for her mother. He had wanted to call her Elizabeth, but the Prince Regent had appeared at the baptism in a vindictive mood and overruled him. The Duke was privately furious. The child slept through it all. Then the Duke himself died. He was convinced, as late as December 1819, that he was the healthiest man in England. He would outlive all his brothers, he said. The crown would come to him and to his children. He went out for a walk one January morning, got his feet wet, neglected to change his stockings, developed a chill, which became inflammation of the lungs, and was dead by the 23rd of January, 1820. Victoria was 8 months old. She had lost her father. 6 days later, the ancient, mad, long-suffering King George III died at Windsor. Within a week, the baby princess had moved several large steps closer to the throne of England without knowing anything about it at all. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, was left in an unenviable position. She was in a foreign country with £6,000 a year and her late husband's considerable debts. She did not speak the language well. She had a baby and a teenage stepdaughter and very little certainty about the future. She considered going back to Germany, to Amerbach, to a quieter life among her own people. She was talked out of it, partly by her own love for the baby, partly by Prince Leopold, who contributed financially to the household and persuaded her that the child must be raised as an English princess. So the Duchess stayed on at Kensington Palace, and there, in an apartment not of the grandest kind, the future Queen of England grew up. The household at Kensington was, in some ways, peculiar. The dominant figure outside the Duchess herself was Sir John Conroy, an Irish-born soldier and courtier who who had served the Duke of Kent, and who, after the Duke's death, became the Duchess's most intimate advisor and the effective manager of her household. He was charming, scheming, and ambitious. He was also, most people who dealt with him eventually concluded, rather unscrupulous. What precisely his relationship with the Duchess was, society speculated about endlessly and never determined. But his influence over her was enormous, and through her, he exercised a degree of influence over Victoria's upbringing that the princess later found impossible to forgive. The system by which Victoria was raised, it became known eventually as the Kensington system, though nobody used that name at the time, was designed with a specific purpose: to make Victoria dependent, isolated, and manageable. She was never allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's room every night. She was never permitted to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. She was kept away from other children, away from the court, away from anyone who might form an independent channel of influence to her. She was never allowed to meet her Uncle William, the King, on any terms that might produce genuine warmth between them. She was, in short, being kept in a gilded cage, and the people holding the door shut were her own mother and Sir John Conroy. They were not precisely cruel to her, but they were very thorough. The one figure in the household who stood between Victoria and the full weight of this system was her governess, the Baroness Lehzen. Lehzen was the daughter of a Hanoverian clergyman, a plain, intelligent, devoted woman who had previously been governess to the Princess Feodora. She attached herself to Victoria with a completeness that was, on both sides, nearly absolute. She was there when Victoria woke. She was there when Victoria went to bed. She listened to everything. She noticed everything. She was protective and steady and deeply beloved. And she gave the princess, in the absence of almost every other form of human warmth that was not conditional on obedience, a kind of anchor. Victoria herself was not naturally docile. She was, in fact, naturally the opposite. She was vivid, tempestuous, easily moved to laughter, and just as easily moved to fury. She had a temper that could be staggering in its intensity, and a charm that could be equally extraordinary. She loved riding. She loved dancing. She loved her King Charles spaniel, Dash, with an earnestness that never wavered. She loved music, genuinely, not as an accomplishment. And she had a voice that was said to be beautiful, clear, and unusually strong for a woman of her slight frame. She drew and painted with real enthusiasm. She filled journals obsessively with an energy and vividness of phrase that owed nothing to training and everything to the sheer force of her personality. But she was, for all this vitality, profoundly alone. Feodora was taken from her by marriage when Victoria was 12, escaping Kensington, as Feodora herself later admitted, with intense relief. The only companions of her childhood were the dolls she collected, over 100 of them, tiny wooden figures she dressed with meticulous care, inventing names and histories for each one. And there were the lessons, endless lessons: French, German, Latin, history, geography, arithmetic, music, drawing, deportment. She was educated with genuine seriousness, if not always with great wisdom, and she absorbed what she was taught with a thoroughness that surprised even those who had arranged the teaching. It was during one of these lessons, when Victoria was around 13 years old, that the decisive moment occurred. She was working through a genealogical table, a chart of the English royal succession, and she came to a page that showed her, with devastating clarity, exactly how close she stood to the throne of England. She had not, apparently, fully understood this before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up and said, with the gravity of someone much older, "I see I am nearer to the throne than I thought." A pause. Then, with perfect composure, "I will be good." Those 5 words have been repeated so often since that they risk becoming a cliché, but they are worth sitting with. There was no performance in them. There was no audience worth performing for. Just Letson, who had heard and said nothing. They were a genuine declaration of intent from a child of 13 in response to a piece of information that would have overwhelmed many adults. She saw what was expected of her, and she chose to meet it. The years between that moment and her accession were not easy ones. Victoria continued to chafe against the constraints of the Kensington system. Conroy attempted on at least one occasion, when she was ill and therefore vulnerable, to persuade her to sign a document granting him a permanent position in her future household. She refused emphatically. King William IV, who had come to the throne in 1830 on the death of George IV, maintained a furiously antagonistic relationship with the Duchess of Kent throughout his reign, largely because the Duchess kept refusing to bring Victoria to court in the way the king wished. The atmosphere at Kensington was one of constant tension, small humiliations, and closely guarded resentments. In the summer of 1836, however, something happened that briefly pierced the gloom. 2 young German princes came to visit, Ernest and Albert, the sons of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg. They were cousins of Victoria, and their visit had been arranged by Prince Leopold with exactly the matchmaking intention it appeared to have. Victoria was 17. She had no experience of the world. She had barely met any young men her own age. She had been given no opportunity to develop the kind of taste that comes from comparison. She was utterly enchanted. She wrote about both princes in her journal with the enthusiasm she brought to everything she liked. But her enthusiasm for Albert was unmistakably of a different order. "Albert is extremely handsome," she wrote, "and so excessively like me that it quite frightened me." She admired his large blue eyes, his beautiful nose, his sweet mouth, and fine teeth. She danced with him. She played piano while he listened. When the cousins left after 3 weeks, she felt as though something had been taken from her, though she could not have said exactly what, because she had no vocabulary yet for what she felt. But there was no time for romance. Victoria was 17, and the king was dying. William IV had been in poor health for some time, and in the spring of 1837, it became clear that he was sinking. He had one last ambition: to survive until the 18th of May, 1837, Victoria's 18th birthday, so that if he died before she turned 18, a regency would be required, and that regency would, by law, be administered by the Duchess of Kent, under the probable influence of Conroy. He made it. He lived past her birthday, and then he let go. He died in the early hours of June the 20th, 1837, on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. He had mentioned it to his doctor the day before, He would like to live to see that day again. He did. One of his last remarks, upon being told he might live many more sunsets, was characteristic. "Oh, that's quite another thing. That's quite another thing." And then he died. When the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace at 5 o'clock in the morning, they had considerable difficulty getting in. The palace staff were not expecting them, or were not organized, or were simply still asleep. Eventually, they were admitted. The Duchess of Kent was woken. She woke Victoria. The princess got out of bed, put on her dressing gown, and came into the room where the men were waiting. She came in alone. Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain, fell on his knees. He officially announced the death of the king. The Archbishop added some personal details. Victoria stood before them and received the news with a composure that neither man had expected. She knew what it meant. She was Queen of England. She wrote in her journal that evening, "Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this station, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things, inexperienced, but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." And then she set immediately to work. At 9 o'clock that morning, Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, arrived at Kensington Palace. He came in full court dress and kissed her hand. She saw him alone. The first time in her life she had ever been entirely alone in a room with a man other than a doctor, and told him that it had long been her intention to retain him and the rest of the present ministry at the head of affairs. He kissed her hand again, bowed, and withdrew. At 11 o'clock, she went downstairs to hold her first Privy Council. The great assembly of lords and ministers, bishops and generals, men who had governed England for decades, saw the doors thrown open and a very short, very slim girl in deep plain mourning walk into the room alone. She moved, every observer noted, with extraordinary dignity. She was not beautiful. Her eyes were too prominent, her chin too receding. But there was something about her carriage, something about the composure of that young face, that was utterly arresting. She read her address in a high, clear, unwavering voice. When it was done, she rose and passed back out of the room with the same consummate grace with which she had entered, and the men of England behind her were left to marvel at what they had just seen. The Duke of Wellington, who had witnessed rather a lot in his life, said he had never seen anything more impressive. If she had been his own daughter, he told a friend, he could not have been more proud. Lord Melbourne came back that afternoon and stayed for 2 hours. He came again the next day and the day after that. Within a few weeks, he was coming every day, sometimes twice. Within a month, everyone in the court understood that an extraordinary thing was happening. The most powerful man in English political life had fallen entirely, irreversibly, under the spell of an 18-year-old queen. William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, was 58 years old when Victoria came to the throne. He was tall and handsome in the way that dissolute men are sometimes handsome, a little loosened by experience, a little too comfortable in his body, but with the ease and authority that comes from decades of moving through the highest rooms in England. He had been given beauty and brains in abundance. He had also been given great misfortune. His marriage to the wild and brilliant and ultimately catastrophic Lady Caroline Lamb, who made such a devastating exhibition of herself over Lord Byron that the whole of London spoke of nothing else for months, had left him scarred in ways he preferred not to discuss. His only child, a son, was mentally incapacitated and died young. His career had twice been nearly destroyed by accusations of criminal conversation, the polite term of the era for adultery, both times involving women who had apparently pursued him rather than the reverse, and both times ending in his acquittal. He had survived it all. He had emerged on the other side with a philosophy that expressed itself as wit, a quality of attention that felt like warmth, and an indifference to conventional opinion that read, at first glance, as charm. He was, in the view of many who knew him, a man of first-rate intelligence, who had never quite lived up to his own capacities. He had a marvelous conversation, a wide-ranging curiosity, a gift for anecdote that kept tables in laughter for hours. He read deeply and remembered everything. He had opinions about theology, about history, about the nature of political life, about the character of women, about the proper role of government, about almost everything one could have opinions about. He was also, and he knew it, lazy. He was too comfortable in his cynicism. He had seen enough of human folly to find enthusiasm for reform rather touching and slightly absurd. He did what needed to be done, but not more than needed to be done, and sometimes not quite all of that. He was, Greville said, the most agreeable man in England, and the least trustworthy Prime Minister. He had, in the years of his prime, been deeply in love with love itself. He had loved Lady Caroline Lamb in his way, even when she was making his life a catastrophe. He had loved Caroline Norton, the writer and poet and reformer, with whom he was associated for years, even when that association very nearly destroyed his career. He was a man who found women interesting, who listened to them with a quality of attention that many women found rare and wonderful, who took their opinions seriously in a way that most men of his class and time did not. Now he was old and rather tired, and here was this girl, this startling, vivid, impossible girl, who needed someone to teach her everything. He was the right person. He had very little doubt about that. Their relationship was, to the observers of the court, slightly baffling and entirely touching. It was clearly not romantic, though gossips would always gossip, and Melbourne had enough of a history to make even clearly non-romantic relationships seem potentially otherwise. It was not purely professional, though it functioned as a mentorship of sorts. It was more like what might happen if a very charming, very wise grandfather suddenly found himself with a granddaughter who was both the most important person in the country and one of the most interesting people he had ever met. Melbourne taught Victoria. He told her about history and politics and personalities. He gossiped with her, which she adored. He shared his peculiar observations on religious doctrine, which shocked and delighted her in equal measure. He gave her his verdict on books and people and policies, and she absorbed all of it with the eagerness of someone who had been kept on a very restricted diet and was suddenly presented with a banquet. He had a way of saying things that were both penetrating and comfortable at the same time. He would make a sharp observation and then lean back with the air of a man who has said what needed saying, and is content to let it settle. She found this irresistible. She wrote about him in her journal with a frequency and warmth that was, years later, startling to reread. He ate at her table every day, almost. He rode with her in the mornings, keeping up with her characteristic pace without apparent effort. He danced with her in the evenings, formally, correctly, because everything at court was done formally and correctly, but with a quality of ease that made the formality feel like something they had agreed to as a game rather than something required. He stayed late, later than protocol strictly demanded. He was the last person she spoke to in the evenings, and often the first person she thought of in the mornings. "I have no object in life but to serve her," he wrote to a friend, and though this was the kind of thing statesmen said, there was a quality of genuine feeling in it that went beyond the usual formulas. For her part, Victoria was besotted, not romantically, not in the way she would later feel about Albert, but with a wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to everything she loved. She could not imagine life without him. When political pressures threatened his government, she could not conceal her anxiety. When he fell ill, she worried. When he was forced from office, temporarily, as it turned out, by the bedchamber crisis, she was genuinely, briefly bereft. She was also happy in a way that she had not been before and would not be quite in this way again. Being queen suited her. The composure she had shown at that first council was not a performance. It was her actual self. She had an instinct for the dignity of the position that needed no instruction. She enjoyed power in the uncomplicated way of someone who has spent their whole life with other people exercising it over them and is now, at last, in a position to exercise it themselves. She enjoyed being taken seriously. For the first time in her life, Conroy had no authority over her. She had dismissed him from her household on the day of her accession with a firmness and dispatch that surprised people who had thought of her as a sheltered girl. She had moved her mother into a separate bedroom. She was, for the first time, alone in her own life, or as alone as a queen ever gets, which is not very alone, but it felt, after the Kensington system, like freedom. There was a shadow to all of this happiness. Two shadows, actually. The first was the Lady Flora Hastings affair. Lady Flora was a lady-in-waiting who had returned from Scotland in early 1839, in the same carriage as the despised Sir John Conroy. Shortly afterwards, her figure appeared to change in a way that tongues, those irrepressible engines of court life, could not resist commenting upon. The whisper spread that Lady Flora was pregnant. The whisper reached the Queen. The Queen had never liked Lady Flora, who was associated with Conroy and had a talent for malicious jokes. Victoria pressed, with all the urgency of her nature, for a medical examination. Lady Flora submitted to it under protest, finding the experience humiliating to a degree that was difficult to overstate. The two doctors who examined her signed a certificate confirming that she was not pregnant. She was, in fact, dying of a tumor of the liver that had been gradually distending her abdomen for months. The Hastings family were powerful and outraged. They demanded audiences. They wrote to newspapers. They required the dismissal of the royal physician, Sir James Clark, whose careless talk had done so much to inflame the matter. The Duke of Wellington consulted, as he always was, in moments of extreme difficulty, advised that Clark could not be dismissed without a public inquiry, and that a public inquiry would make everything worse. So Clark stayed, and the court's culpability in the whole embarrassing affair was left to fester in the public mind. By the time Lady Flora died, in July of 1839, the popular mood was ugly. Victoria was hissed at Ascot. Pamphlets circulated. The radiance of goodwill with which her reign had begun 2 years earlier had entirely dissipated. The second shadow was the bedchamber crisis of 1839, which arrived at almost the same moment. Melbourne's government had been weakening for months. They had only a thin majority in the Commons, and it was growing thinner. In May, it finally fell, and Victoria was obliged to send for Sir Robert Peel, the Tory leader, to form a new ministry. Peel, as was customary, requested that the Queen replace some of her ladies-in-waiting, who were the wives and relations of Whig politicians, with Tory ladies as a visible symbol of the new political alignment. Victoria refused. She was absolutely immovable. She would not part with a single one of her ladies. They were her personal household and had nothing to do with politics. Peel explained gently that this was not quite the constitutional position. Victoria was unmoved. Peel declined to form a government. Melbourne returned, and Victoria won her point. Politically, it was a fiasco. She looked stubborn and partisan, unable to separate her personal preferences from her public responsibilities. Lord Melbourne, who had allowed the whole crisis to develop when a firmer hand might have prevented it, was privately alarmed at what it revealed about her character. The newspapers, which had been on her side, turned against her. She had won the battle and weakened her position in the process. What saved everything, what changed everything, was the arrival in October of 1839 of a certain German prince. Victoria had been told for several years that she ought to consider marrying Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg. Her uncle Leopold, who had been nudging this match for years with the quiet persistence of a very experienced diplomat, had arranged a visit. Victoria had met Albert once before, 3 years earlier, and had admired him very much. But she had also written to Leopold with characteristic bluntness that she could not possibly think of marrying for at least 3 or 4 years. She needed time. She needed to consolidate herself in her position. She was not ready. And then Albert walked into the room, and she changed her mind in approximately 5 minutes. It was with some emotion, she wrote in her journal that evening, that I beheld Albert, who was beautiful. He had grown since she had seen him last. He was 20, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair, large blue eyes, and a profile that struck her as something out of a Renaissance painting. He was serious in expression, graceful in movement, reserved in manner, which suited her because she could make up for any reserve with enthusiasm enough for both of them. He danced beautifully. He played piano. He had a quality of attentiveness that she had rarely encountered in anyone who was not paid to pay attention to her. Within 5 days, she had made her decision. Within a week, she had chosen the moment. There was only one difficulty. As queen, she would have to propose to him herself. No man could propose to the sovereign of England. She would have to ask. On the morning of October the 15th, 1839, she summoned Albert to a private audience and told him, looking directly at him with those prominent blue eyes, that it would make her too happy if he would consent to what she wished. He assented with warmth, with what she described as the most gratifying and endearing manner. They were alone together. He took her hands. She told him she was quite unworthy of him. He replied, she wrote, that he would make it his whole study to render her happiness his highest aim. They spent the next several days in a state of mutual enchantment, unlike anything either had previously experienced. They rode together and danced together and talked about music and art and looked at each other with a slightly stupefied intensity of two people who have just discovered that happiness is not, after all, a myth. She stayed up until midnight, which was unheard of for Victoria. He clasped me in his arms, she wrote, and we kissed each other again and again. She had never been kissed before in her life. She was 20 years old. They married on the 10th of February, 1840. Victoria wore white, a choice that was considered unconventional, since royal brides typically wore silver or gold, and in doing so launched a fashion tradition that has endured remarkably to the present day. She was carried away with emotion throughout the ceremony. She wept. She had never looked better in her life. Several observers agreed, though she had never particularly cared about her appearance before. When it was done, when they were finally alone together, she felt, she wrote, as if a completely new life had begun. It had, but it was more complicated than she had imagined. Albert arrived in England as a young man without a role, without an income of his own, without any formal title, and without any real authority over his own household. Parliament, when asked to define his position and provide an appropriate income, had been ungenerously contentious. The political opposition had objected to giving him precedence above the princes of the royal blood. His proposed annuity of £50,000 had been cut to £30,000. He was not English. He was not understood. He was regarded by the court, by the political establishment, by significant sections of the public, as an intelligent and decorative foreigner who had been permitted into the family and should be grateful for it. This attitude overlooked something important. Albert was, in almost every measurable respect, considerably more intelligent, more disciplined, more thoughtful, and more far-sighted than almost anyone in the rooms he was being shut out of. He had been educated with great seriousness by Baron Stockmar, the remarkable advisor who had served Prince Leopold since the days of Princess Charlotte, and who had come to see the preparation of Albert for this marriage as a kind of life's work. Albert had studied history, philosophy, law, science, and music. He had a penetrating, analytical mind and an unusual capacity for sustained, systematic work. He was interested in everything. Not the unfocused curiosity of a dilettante, but the deep, methodical attention of a man who genuinely wants to understand. He cared about art, about science, about political economy, about social reform, about the condition of working people in England. He had, in short, all the qualities that the situation required, and the situation would not let him exercise them. The first years of the marriage were genuinely difficult in ways that did not show on the surface, but that were felt very keenly by both parties. Victoria loved him, passionately, completely, without reservation. But she was also a queen who had spent 3 years learning to be a queen, and she had developed habits of command that were not easily modified for a husband's benefit. She had been told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that Albert's role was domestic and decorative and supportive. She had Lord Melbourne to advise her on political matters. She had her own instincts, which she trusted. What she had not been prepared for was the discovery that Albert had views on political matters too, very good ones, and that being kept away from them was making him miserable. There was also the question of Baroness Letson. Letson had been Victoria's most intimate companion for 15 years. She had been there through everything: the loneliness of childhood, the constraints of the Kensington system, the exhilarating first months of queenship. Victoria loved her with the fierce gratitude of someone who has been protected through a period of great vulnerability. But Albert saw Letson with different eyes. He saw a woman who had become accustomed to managing Victoria's domestic life, and who was deeply resistant to any change in that arrangement. She ran the household. She controlled access to the Queen. She managed the nursery. And in the nursery, Albert found things that alarmed him deeply. A child, the first of their children, the Princess Royal, who was being handled, he believed, in ways that endangered her health and development. The conflict between Albert and Letson was quiet but total, and it placed Victoria in an impossible position. The person she had loved longest was in direct, implacable opposition to the person she loved most. For months, more than a year, perhaps 2, she was torn between them. She oscillated. She defended Letson to Albert and defended Albert to Letson. She wrote letters to Melbourne that revealed, in their anxious self-justification, how much the conflict was costing her. She had headaches and tears and outbursts that she later found it hard to account for. Then, in the summer of 1842, there was a crisis over the management of the royal nursery that brought matters to a head. Albert wrote Victoria a memorandum, cold in its precision, devastating in its conclusions, that documented Letson's interference in careful detail and made clear that the situation could not continue. Victoria read it, was devastated, argued back, cried, and then, over several painful days, came to see that Albert was right. In September of 1842, Baroness Letson was pensioned off with great ceremony and sent back to Germany. She never returned. Victoria wept. She wrote letters to Letson for years afterwards, affectionate letters full of memories. But she did not try to bring her back. And from the moment of Letson's departure, the marriage became something different, something fuller and more equal. Albert began, slowly, to take his rightful place. The process by which he moved from decorative prince to effective co-sovereign was gradual and required immense patience on his part. But it was inexorable. He began with the household in 1844 after careful investigation by Stockmar, who produced a lengthy memorandum on the subject. Albert tackled the administration of the royal palaces and found it in a state that would have been comic had it not been so expensive. The control of the household was divided between a bewildering array of officials: the Lord Steward, the Lord Chamberlain, the Master of the Horse, the Office of Woods and Forests, whose respective powers and responsibilities were so unclear that nobody could say with confidence who was in charge of what. The practical consequences were absurd. The insides of the palace windows were cleaned by the Lord Chamberlain's department, the outsides by the Office of Woods and Forests. The footmen took their orders from the master of the horse, the housemaids from the Lord Chamberlain, the cooks from the Lord Steward. When the Queen noticed there was never a fire in the dining room and inquired why, she was told that the Lord Steward laid the fires and the Lord Chamberlain lit them, and the two departments had failed to come to an accommodation. She ate in the cold. There was also the affair of the boy Jones, a remarkable episode that illuminated the chaos of palace security. 3 days after the birth of the Princess Royal, a suspicious noise was heard in the room next to the Queen's bedroom. A page looked under a large sofa and found crouching there a most repulsive figure, an undersized 17-year-old boy, son of a tailor, who had apparently climbed over the garden wall and walked in through an open window. He cheerfully explained, spent 3 days hiding under various beds, helped himself to soup and other eatables, sat upon the throne, seen the Queen, and heard the Princess Royal cry. He was sent to a house of correction. When he got out, he went back to the palace. He was caught again and sent back. When released, he lingered around the gates until the authorities, dispensing with any legal process, shipped him off to sea. His ship put in at Portsmouth to refit. He immediately disembarked and walked back to London, was caught before he reached the palace, and sent back to his ship. He later fell overboard in the Mediterranean, and it was suspected he had done it deliberately to see the life buoy light burning. Albert swept all of this away. He reorganized the household under a single master of the household who was responsible for everything. He renegotiated the preposterous perquisites and ancient sinecures that had been draining money from the royal accounts for generations. He discovered that there was a weekly expenditure of 35 shillings on red room wine, which turned out to be a payment dating from the reign of George III, when a room in Windsor had been used as a guard room, and officers had been allowed 5 shillings a day for wine. The guard had moved decades ago. The payment continued, quietly enriching a half-pay officer who held the sinecure of under-butler and had, in the course of his duties, apparently never poured a glass of anything for anyone. He was offered the choice of relinquishing the payment or actually performing the job. He chose the payment. The candle rule was even better. It was an immemorial tradition of the royal household that a candle once lit could never be lit again. Old candles, slightly used, perfectly serviceable candles, were simply thrown away. Tens of thousands of them every year, vanishing into whatever shadowy economy received them. Nobody knew. Nobody had thought to ask. Albert asked. He reformed. He saved enormous sums of money, organized everything with Germanic precision, and was accused of meddling and penny pinching and treating the palace like a counting house. He paid no attention to the accusations and continued. Simultaneously, and far more significantly, he was making himself indispensable in Victoria's political and administrative life. He had been present at her audiences with ministers since the early days of the marriage. At first as a quiet observer, gradually as a participant, eventually as something close to an equal. He drafted letters, He corrected memoranda. He advised on appointments. He read the dispatches. He had views on everything, and his views were almost invariably the best informed and most carefully reasoned in the room. By the end of Sir Robert Peel's administration in 1846, it could be said without serious exaggeration that Albert had become, in effect, the co-sovereign of England. His greatest personal triumph came in 1851 with the Great Exhibition. The idea, a vast international exhibition of industry and design, housed in a purpose-built palace of glass in Hyde Park, was not entirely his, but the energy that turned idea into reality was almost wholly his. He worked on it for years, negotiating, organizing, cajoling, overcoming the objections of those who thought it would attract anarchists or foreigners or the wrong sort of people. The Crystal Palace, 6 million square feet of glass and iron, designed by Joseph Paxton, assembled in months, containing 14,000 exhibitors from 44 countries, was a monument to industrial modernity and national confidence, such as the world had not seen before. 6 million people visited it in the 5 months it was open. Queen Victoria herself went more than 40 times, dragging various members of her household along, overwhelmed each time with what she described as indescribable emotion. She was proud of Albert for the exhibition, thoroughly, genuinely, unperformatively proud, in the way she was proud of everything he did, which was in the way you are proud of someone whose worth you have understood more fully than anyone else. He was, she wrote, the most wonderful man. She wrote this again and again in various letters and journals, with the repetitive conviction of someone who has found a truth they keep needing to reaffirm. Their domestic life at this period was happy in a way that was remarkable, given how much they had gone through to get there. They had 9 children. 9. And Victoria hated being pregnant with a vehemence she never bothered to conceal. She found childbearing undignified. She found babies, as she once put it, frog-like. She found the whole process an interruption of her real life, her working life, the life of state. She resented it more than she resented almost anything else, and yet she also loved her children fiercely and demonstratively as they grew. She was a mother of the kind who shouts and weeps and laughs too loudly and says things she later has to apologize for, and who is, for all that, the beating heart of the family. They had built Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. Albert's vision, his design, his project. It was granite and baronial and rather overwhelming, with tartans on every surface. Albert designed a tartan. Victoria designed a tartan. They both considered this perfectly reasonable, and it was also, for Victoria, as close to paradise as anything she had ever experienced. She could ride for hours through the hills. She could visit tenants in their cottages. She could pretend for a few weeks every year to be an ordinary woman living a life that was not composed entirely of dispatches and audiences and formal ceremonies. Albert would stalk deer and build cairns and express great satisfaction with the views, and Victoria would sit and sketch and think that she had never been so happy. "It is a happiness to see him," she wrote, watching Albert climb a mountain to plant a flag at the top. "Oh, what can equal the beauties of nature?" This happiness, complete, golden, domestic, sustained, was what made everything that came after so completely devastating. In the autumn of 1861, Albert fell ill. He had been deteriorating for some time, though this was not fully recognized at the time. He was 42 years old, and he looked and felt older. The work of the previous 20 years had been extraordinary in its volume and variety, and he had driven himself through all of it with a discipline that left no room for rest. He believed, as a matter of genuine philosophy, that idleness was one of the cardinal sins. He worked in the mornings before Victoria was awake. He worked in the evenings after she had gone to bed. He worked through illness and fatigue and the melancholy that had been a feature of his temperament since childhood, a deep constitutional sadness that the busy surface of his life did not entirely conceal. Those who knew him well saw it. Victoria, who loved him more deeply than anyone, chose not to see it, or perhaps could not afford to. He was also, those who knew him could see, a profoundly lonely man in certain respects. He had spent his adult life in a country that had never entirely accepted him, not out of malice exactly, but out of something harder to argue with: indifference. The English were not interested in being reformed. They were not interested in German notions of systematic efficiency or philosophical rigor or the elevation of public taste. They wanted their government to muddle through in the traditional English fashion, and they wanted their court to be English, and Albert was not English and never would be. He had given everything: his time, his intelligence, his health. And England had given him in return a great deal of splendor and very little genuine gratitude. He had once said to Victoria, in a moment of unusual frankness, that he did not cling to life. "You do," he had told her, "but I set no store by it. I am sure that if I had a severe illness, I should give up at once. I should not struggle for life. I have no tenacity of life." Victoria had not taken this seriously. It was the kind of thing melancholy Germans said, she probably thought. Albert said a great many things. In the spring of 1861, his father died. The bereavement struck him with a heaviness that surprised those around him. His father had been elderly. The death was not unexpected, and yet Albert seemed unable to recover from it. He was already, by the summer, looking older than his years. Then in August, his beloved cousin and close friend, King Pedro of Portugal, died of typhoid fever. Pedro had been one of Albert's closest remaining connections to the Germany of his boyhood. Another earnest, idealistic young prince who had married into a foreign throne and tried to do good. His death hit Albert hard. Then, in November, there was the affair of the Prince of Wales. Bertie, Edward, Prince of Wales, had been, from his earliest years, a source of anxiety to his parents. Albert had designed an educational program for his eldest son of almost punishing thoroughness. Languages, history, science, political economy, moral philosophy, and more, in a schedule so densely packed that it left almost no room for the kind of aimless play and sociability that most children of his age took for granted. The theory was that Bertie's character, which Albert had identified as insufficiently serious, could be corrected by sufficiently systematic instruction. The practice was that Bertie responded to all of this by being pleasant, amiable, good-natured, and completely incapable of retaining anything he was taught. He was not unintelligent. He was simply, temperamentally, entirely unlike his father, and the more pressure Albert applied, the more comprehensively Bertie failed to respond to it. He had been sent to Cambridge, partly to give him some independence, quietly in the hope that university life would achieve what private tutors had not. At Cambridge, or near it, he had been introduced by a group of young officers to a young woman named Nellie Clifton, an actress, and had spent several nights in her company. When Albert found out, and it became known rapidly, as these things do, the effect on him was devastating. It was not simply the act itself, though he was genuinely horrified by it. It was the fear of what it signified. Not merely that Bertie had been foolish, but that Bertie, heir to the throne, might have permanently compromised himself in ways that could not be undone. Albert wrote his son a letter of such painful moral seriousness that it is difficult to read even now. Then, already ill and exhausted, he traveled to Cambridge in cold, wet November weather to speak to the boy in person. He came back hollow-eyed and haggard. Those who saw him in those final weeks of November noted and worried. But no one said anything clearly enough, or to the right people, and the doctors, principal among them, the elderly Sir James Clark, who had been royal physician since the Lady Flora affair, and who retained his position despite having been wrong about almost everything he was ever asked about, told Victoria that there was no cause for particular alarm. There was cause. Albert had almost certainly been drinking contaminated water at Windsor for some time. The drainage system at the castle was a disgrace. It had been reported on, complained about, recommended for improvement, and nothing adequate had been done. Typhoid was moving through the castle's water supply, quiet and lethal, and Albert's body, worn down by 2 decades of unrelenting work and a grief he had not allowed himself to properly experience, had nothing left with which to fight it. For 2 weeks, Victoria sat at his bedside. She read to him Peveril of the Peak by Walter Scott, a book she knew he liked, and he showed, at first, that he could follow the story. He murmured to her, sometimes in English, sometimes in German, calling her Liebes Frauchen, dear little wife, and stroking her cheek when she leaned close. Sometimes he was lucid and almost himself. Sometimes he drifted. Once he asked for music, a fine chorale at a distance, and Princess Alice played Lutheran hymns on a piano in the next room, and Albert listened and repeated quietly to himself, "The Rock of Ages." Once in his wandering, he was back in Rosenau, his boyhood home in Coburg, hearing the birds in the early morning. Victoria, even now, even sitting beside him, day after day, watching him fail, refused to believe he was dying. She had an enormous fund of vitality, and she could not imagine that his might give out. Sir James Clark continued to tell her everything was satisfactory. She wrote to her uncle Leopold 2 days before the end that there was nothing to cause alarm. She did not see the doctor who had been brought in at Palmerston's insistence, Dr. Watson, who had looked at Albert once and known immediately that he had come too late. On the morning of December the 14th, he seemed briefly better. Victoria took this as a sign. It was not a sign. By afternoon, he had relapsed, and the relapse was catastrophic. The children were brought in, all 9 of them, or those who were old enough to understand what was happening, to take a silent farewell of their father. He was breathing strangely. His features seemed to be arranging themselves into something other than his usual expression. Victoria wrote in her journal that evening, "It was a terrible moment, but thank God I was able to command myself and to be perfectly calm. and remained sitting by his side. He murmured something she could not hear. She thought he was speaking French. Then he began to move his hands, slowly, in the air, and she recognized the gesture. It was the gesture he made when dressing, when he was arranging his hair. She leaned close and whispered to him, "Es kleines Frauchen." He seemed to hear, his hands stilled. She went briefly into an adjoining room. She was called back immediately. She saw at once when she looked at him that everything had changed. She knelt by the bed. He breathed again, and then he did not breathe. She shrieked. A long, wild, terrible sound that rang through the castle. Then she did not speak for a long time. He was 42 years old. He had given England 21 years of extraordinary, unacknowledged, largely unappreciated service. He had been, as Disraeli would later say in a private letter, the only person who realized the ideal. Though he said it with political intent, there was truth in it. Albert had been, in almost every sense that matters, a genuinely great man, and he was gone. Victoria held his hand until it grew cold. She kissed his face. She was 42 years old, and her real life, as she understood it, was over. She went on living for 40 more years, but she was never the same. What followed was the strangest chapter in British royal history. A woman who was also the most powerful individual in the world, descending into a grief so complete, so absolute, so entirely given over, that it became less like mourning and more like a second life, lived entirely in the shadow of the first. Victoria mourned Albert with everything she had, and she had a great deal. She was constitutionally incapable of doing anything in half measures. She wore black every day for the rest of her reign. 40 years of unrelieved mourning. She had his clothes laid out every morning, as if he might still dress. She slept with a cast of his hand on the pillow beside her. She spoke of him in the present tense. She had the hot water and towels brought to his room long after there was anyone to use them, because those had been the instructions, and she would not change the instructions. She went through his papers with meticulous devotion and began to arrange for his letters and memoranda to be collected and eventually published. She insisted that his doctors provide detailed accounts of his final illness, which she read over and over again. She visited his rooms at Windsor and sat in them for hours. She carried everywhere a locket containing his portrait. She wore a miniature of him on her wrist. She placed photographs of him on every surface of every room she occupied. She spoke of him to her children and her ladies and her ministers with an intensity that alarmed them, not because her grief was inappropriate, but because it showed no signs of diminishing, and because it was becoming clear that the Queen of England had decided, quite deliberately, to stop living in the present tense. The practical consequences were immediate and severe. Victoria withdrew from public life to a degree that alarmed, and then infuriated, and then seriously embarrassed the people who served her. She would not open Parliament in person, not in 1862, not in 1863, not in the years after that. She refused to appear at state functions. She rejected invitations. She would not be seen in London. She shut herself away at Windsor and at Osborne and at Balmoral, rotating between her various retreats with the methodical sadness of someone serving a sentence. When ministers needed to see her, they made the journey to Windsor, where she received them in a black dress, glanced over dispatch boxes with an expression of magnificent suffering, and signed the documents put before her with the efficiency of someone who has decided that the work must continue, even if life itself has essentially stopped. The public, which had loved her since the beginning of her reign and had wept for her at Albert's death, turned against her with startling swiftness. Republican pamphlets circulated through London's poorer districts. Radical newspapers asked, with pointed arithmetic, what exactly the Queen was doing to justify an annual civil list payment of several £100,000 if she would not perform the most basic public duties of her office. Charles Bradlaugh, the radical MP, wrote that the monarchy was becoming a superfluous institution. A pamphlet called "What Does She Do With It?" was distributed by the thousands, asking pointed questions about the royal finances. She was called the Royal Recluse. She was called the Widow of Windsor. She was called, in the press and in satirical sketches, Mrs. Brown. She was jeered at in public on the rare occasions when she appeared. There were serious discussions in political circles about whether the monarchy itself had a future in England. And in 1870 and 1871, when revolution overthrew the French Empire and Republican sentiment swept across Europe, those discussions became briefly quite urgent. Victoria was aware of all of it. She read the newspapers. She was told what was being said. She was visited by ministers and family members and advisors who all, in their various ways, attempted to communicate to her that things could not go on like this, that her withdrawal from public life was doing real damage to the institution she had spent 60 years embodying. She listened to them with apparent attention and then continued exactly as before. She had made up her mind about how her life would be lived, and the opinions of ministers and pamphlet writers and the general public, however strongly expressed, were not going to change it. Through all of this, through the hissing in the pamphlets and the Republican agitation and the near universal pressure from her advisors and her ministers and her family, Victoria was sustained by one unlikely companion. John Brown, a Highland gillie from Balmoral, who had been Albert's personal attendant. Brown was not a complicated man, or at least not obviously complicated. He was blunt. He was rough in his manners. He was constitutionally immune to the protocols of court life, and clearly felt that these protocols were, in their entirety, a waste of everyone's time. He had grown up in the Highlands, among people who addressed each other directly and meant what they said and didn't particularly care what anyone else thought about it. He had brought this quality, unmodified, to the most formal court in Europe, and the results were startling. He called the Queen woman, not Your Majesty, not ma'am, but woman, in the way a Scottish farmer talks to his wife when he wants her to do something sensible. He told her when she was being unreasonable. He told her when the weather was too bad to go out and she should stay inside. And he told her when the weather was fine and she had no excuse for moping indoors. He led her pony with a competence that brooked no argument. He organized her excursions with a practicality that she found, after the elaborate deference of everyone else around her, deeply refreshing. He carried her in and out of carriages with a matter-of-factness that was almost the opposite of constant physical presence in her life in the years after Albert's death. The person who made sure she went outside, who made sure she ate, who made sure she maintained some connection to the physical world that she seemed always on the verge of abandoning entirely. What he gave her that no one else could give was honesty. The court was full of people who agreed with everything she said. The ministers were diplomatically careful. Even her children, who loved her and occasionally argued with her, could not argue from the position of someone who had nothing to lose. Brown had nothing to lose. He was not ambitious. He was not maneuvering for position. He simply thought what he thought and said what he said. And if the queen was being foolish, he told her so, in terms that left no ambiguity. She needed that after 40 years of people managing her and maneuvering around her and carefully calibrating every word they said in her presence. The unmediated directness of a man who genuinely did not care whether she was pleased with him was paradoxically exactly what she wanted. He had been Albert's man before he was hers. He had served Albert at Balmoral in the happy years. He carried for Victoria the faint but indelible association of those years, of the expeditions and the cairns and the hills and the laughter. He could not restore the dead, but he could serve as a living reminder that the dead had existed, that they had been real, that the life Victoria had lived before December 1861 had actually happened. The court loathed him. The court had always loathed him, from the moment Victoria first started relying on him, and their loathing intensified year by year as his position grew more established and his influence more visible. They found him presumptuous. They found him ignorant. They found him insufferable in his informality and actively offensive in his directness. Senior courtiers who had served the monarchy for decades found themselves outranked in terms of access to the Queen by a man who had grown up on a Scottish farm and had never read a book about protocol in his life. The press speculated endlessly and viciously about the nature of the relationship. Mrs. Brown, the satirical magazines called her, with gleeful cruelty. There were pamphlets suggesting a secret marriage. There were drawings of Brown in a posture of authority over the Queen that was clearly meant to be read as something other than professional. There were demands in Parliament for explanation. There were questions of the most pointed and humiliating kind. Victoria ignored all of it with a serenity that was, depending on your perspective, either admirable or infuriating. She knew what Brown was to her, and she did not feel that she owed anyone an explanation. He was company in the place where she was most alone. He was honest with her in a world where honesty was almost impossible to find. He had been Albert's servant before he was hers, which gave him a standing in her eyes that nothing could remove. When he died in March 1883, of a cold that developed into erysipelas in the way the people you cannot spare always seem to die of something that should have been survivable, Victoria was devastated. She mourned him with an openness that shocked those around her. She wrote a short memoir of him, which was not published. She kept his photograph beside her to the end of her life. She put a lock of his hair in her coffin when she died. Gladstone, who had served as Prime Minister on and off throughout these years, to Victoria's intense displeasure, reportedly read about this last detail with the equanimity of a man for whom nothing about the late Queen could any longer come as a genuine surprise. The man who ultimately rescued the monarchy from the consequences of Victoria's prolonged seclusion, and perhaps rescued Victoria from herself, or at least from the worst of herself, was Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli had been Prime Minister briefly in 1868, but it was his second ministry, beginning in 1874, that defined his relationship with the Queen. He was a figure who does not quite fit any category. The son of a Jewish writer who had converted to Christianity, a novelist of Gothic extravagance, a political adventurer who had climbed to the top of the English establishment by sheer force of personality and a kind of glittering audacity that could not be taught. He had started his career in enormous debt, had dressed flamboyantly, had written novels that polite society found amusing and slightly alarming, and had entered Parliament in the 1830s at a time when the idea of a man of his background ever becoming Prime Minister would have seemed, to most observers, not merely improbable, but essentially impossible. He had done it by being brilliant, and by being patient, and by understanding something about power that most of his contemporaries never grasped, that it is not enough to be right, or even to be effective. You must also be entertaining. The English political class, for all its traditions of solid practicality, was deeply susceptible to a man who could make them feel that public life was interesting. Disraeli made it feel more than interesting. He made it feel romantic. He had, earlier in his career, destroyed Sir Robert Peel with a series of parliamentary attacks so vicious that Albert had said he had not one single element of a gentleman in his composition. This made Victoria's eventual infatuation with him all the more remarkable, and all the more amusing to those observers who remembered her earlier opinions. What changed things was Disraeli's response to Albert's death. While other politicians expressed condolences in the appropriate formulas, kind, correct, ultimately interchangeable, Disraeli wrote to Victoria in a different key altogether. He spoke of Albert not with the conventional sympathy of public life, but with what appeared to be genuine reverence, insisting that Albert had been uniquely great, uniquely admirable, the only man Disraeli had ever known who seemed to have realized the ideal. He elaborated this at length, with the fluency and the depth of feeling of a man who had thought carefully about what he was saying. Though how much of the feeling was genuine and how much theatrical was a question that even Disraeli himself might not have been able to answer. He said that Albert had combined the manly grace and sublime simplicity of chivalry with the intellectual splendor of the Attic academe. He compared him to Sir Philip Sidney. He spoke of his own acquaintance with the prince as having been one of the most satisfactory incidents of his life, full of refined and beautiful memories. Victoria, who was accustomed to feeling that the world had comprehensively failed to understand her husband's worth, was overwhelmed. "He is the only person," she declared, "who has ever appreciated the prince." From that moment forward, Disraeli had a hold on her that nothing could loosen. The relationship that developed was one of the most curious in Victorian political history. Victoria sent him primroses from Osborne and Balmoral. He professed to adore them, which may or may not have been literally true. He addressed her in his letters with an elaborate archness, calling her the fairy. and writing of her as though she were a figure out of legend who had descended temporarily to inhabit the mundane world of Victorian politics. She wrote back with a warmth and a personal candor that she extended to very few. She complained to him, she confided in him, she sent him gifts and received his with extravagant expressions of pleasure. She gave him the title of Earl of Beaconsfield, which he accepted with the gracious equanimity of a man who has always suspected that the world would eventually come around to the right view of his merits. He kissed her hand at audiences not as a duty, but as a ceremony, with a gravity and a style that made it feel momentarily as though the age of chivalry had not entirely passed. She found this enormously gratifying. Most people in her position found ceremony oppressive. Victoria found it sustaining. His greatest political gift to her, the gift that transformed her public life in a way nothing else could have achieved, was the Royal Titles Act of 1876, by which Queen Victoria became Empress of India. It was brilliant political theater. With a single stroke, Disraeli took a queen who had been retreating into embarrassing irrelevance and placed her at the center of the most glamorous imperial narrative the modern world had seen. She was not merely the monarch of a small, damp island on the edge of Europe. She was the empress of the largest empire in history. She was the ruler of 400 million people. She was, as Disraeli put it, with his customary willingness to overstate, the great potentate whom all Asia and Africa regard as their suzerain. Victoria embraced the role with her characteristic, wholehearted enthusiasm. She began studying Hindustani. She engaged Indian servants, the most prominent of whom, Abdul Karim, the Munshi, eventually acquired something of the position that John Brown had held. The court objected to Abdul Karim with the same ferocity they had objected to Brown, and Victoria dismissed their objections with the same serene indifference. She found him interesting. She found his company pleasant. She was determined to learn Hindustani, and she did not see that any of this required the approval of her household. Disraeli himself died in April 1881. Victoria mourned him as she had mourned very few political figures, with a genuine personal grief that went beyond the loss of a useful minister. She planted primroses at his grave. Every year after his death, on the anniversary of it, she sent primroses to the friends who had been his. The Primrose League, a Tory political organization, was founded in his memory and named for what everyone knew was the late Prime Minister's favorite flower. Though Disraeli had once said that he believed the primrose had been one of the late Prince Consort's favorite flowers, and the dedication was really to Albert's memory, which was perhaps a final joke from beyond the grave, or perhaps not. The contrast between Disraeli and William Ewart Gladstone could not have been more complete. Gladstone was learned, principled, industrious, and profoundly moral. He was also, in Victoria's experience of him, absolutely insufferable. Where Disraeli charmed, Gladstone instructed. Where Disraeli flattered, Gladstone reasoned. He wrote her letters of great length and considerable complexity, addressing her as though she were a capable adult, capable of following an argument, which she was, of course. But it was not what she wanted from her Prime Minister. He communicated with her on public business in language of such laborious conscientiousness that she once remarked with characteristic economy, that he spoke to her as if she were a public meeting. She called him that half-mad firebrand. She called him the most dangerous man in England. She wrote to her daughter Vicky that she found him personally repulsive. When his government fell in 1874, she could not entirely conceal her relief. When he was returned to power in 1880, she could barely conceal her despair. During his second ministry, she opposed him on nearly every significant question: Irish policy, the Afghan crisis, the situation in the Sudan, and on the question of the Sudan, when news came that General Gordon had been killed at Khartoum, she sent Gladstone a telegram of rebuke that she sent with magnificent impropriety, not in cipher but in clear, so that every clerk and telegraph operator along the line could read it. Gladstone bore it all with a resigned patience that was, in its own way, admirable. When his ministry fell at last in 1885, and he came to take his leave of the Queen, she received him with formal politeness, and remarked at the end of the audience that she supposed he would now want some rest. He had served her in his 3 governments for 12 years. He noted in his diary afterwards that her mind and opinions had been seriously warped. The final years were something neither of them could have predicted. A resurrection of Victoria's popularity so complete and so fervent that it came to seem to the people who lived through it not like a political phenomenon at all, but like something deeper, something closer to love. It had been building slowly since the mid-1880s. Disraeli's cultivations had helped. The deaths of people Victoria had loved, Melbourne, Letson, Peel, Albert, Brown, Disraeli himself in 1881, and the sympathy those losses generated had helped. The public had watched the widowed Queen weep for her children and her friends with increasing tenderness. There had been an assassination attempt in 1882, the 7th in her reign, a young man named Roderick MacLean firing a pistol at her carriage at Windsor. And the national response, the surge of outrage and protective feeling, had revealed how much the affection that had seemed to disappear in the 1860s had, in fact, merely gone underground, waiting for a reason to express itself. But what really transformed things was time itself. Victoria had been on the throne for long enough that the very fact of her continuance became a kind of wonder. She had been reigning when the grandfathers of her subjects were young men. She had outlasted Wellington, Peel, Palmerston, Russell, Derby, Disraeli, and 4 of her own prime ministers. She was permanent in a way that no human thing is supposed to be permanent. And the English people, for whom continuity is one of the deepest instinctual values, found this increasingly extraordinary. She was not a part of history. She was so old that she was becoming history herself, while still alive, still working, still signing dispatches. The Golden Jubilee of 1887, 50 years on the throne, was a significant celebration. Victoria drove through London in a procession and was met with crowds of genuine, uncomplicated enthusiasm. The Republican agitation of the 1860s and 1870s had evaporated. The anger that had expressed itself as the Royal Recluse and Mrs. Brown had somewhere in the years of Disraeli's enchantment and the quiet accumulation of her old age converted itself into something warmer. but it was the Diamond Jubilee of 1897 that was truly extraordinary. Victoria was 78 years old. She could barely walk without assistance. She was conveyed between her various engagements in a wheeled chair or her small carriage. Her eyesight was failing. Incipient cataracts had made reading increasingly difficult. She could still sign her name, still dictate correspondence, still make her views known on every subject she cared about, which was still every subject. She had outlived almost everyone she had ever known. Melbourne had died in 1848, Wellington in 1852, Peel in 1850, Prince Albert in 1861, Lehzen in 1870, Brown in 1883, Disraeli in 1881. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, had died in 1884. Her daughter, Princess Alice, had died in 1878, on the anniversary of Albert's death. Victoria said it felt like a message. Her granddaughter Marie, the young Princess of Hesse, had died in 1884. Grief had become, for Victoria, the water she swam in, and she had learned, over decades, to swim. She was the grandmother, or great-grandmother, of half the crowned heads of Europe. The Kaiser of Germany was her grandson. The Tsarina of Russia was her granddaughter. Queens and princesses scattered across the royal houses of Europe had sat on her knee as children, and now governed empires of their own. She referred to herself, without any particular irony, as the matriarch of all the families. When the various European royalties gathered for family occasions, as they did for her jubilees, the photograph albums looked like meetings of a rather grand company board, and the Queen of England was unambiguously the chairman. On the day of the Diamond Jubilee procession, June the 22nd, 1897, the streets of London were lined with crowds of a size that had rarely been seen in the history of the city. They began gathering the night before, sleeping on the pavements wrapped in blankets to secure their places. By morning, every window along the route was full. Every rooftop held people. Flags and bunting and imperial symbols draped every surface of the city. It was the largest visible expression of a single nation's feeling that the century had produced. Victoria rode in an open carriage. She was tiny in it, an elderly, white-haired woman in black, almost absurdly small, given the scale of what was being celebrated. The procession moved slowly for her comfort. Around her rode cavalry and guards in their finest dress. Before her and behind her moved the representatives of the empire, men from India and Africa and Australia and Canada and a dozen other territories, in their own uniforms and their own colors, making visible the extraordinary extent of what she nominally ruled. She had not designed this empire. She had not built it. She had presided over it, encouraged it, been made its empress. But the thing itself was larger than any one person's intention. It had grown around her reign, had grown partly because of her reign. And now it was here, filling the streets of London, bowing its collective head. The waves of sound from the crowd were so great that they seemed physical, a force that pressed against the carriage from all sides. Victoria had been told to expect enthusiasm. She had not expected what it would actually feel like. The tears came to her eyes before she had gone a mile, and they did not go away. "How kind they are to me," she kept saying to the lady sitting beside her. "How kind they are. How kind they are." At St. Paul's Cathedral, where a service of thanksgiving was held. She was too frail to leave her carriage. The service was held on the steps, with the clergy ranged below and the crowds filling every available inch of Ludgate Hill in every direction. She sat in her carriage and gave thanks in her heart and let the music wash over her. And she thought about the 60 years and all the people and all the work and all the grief. And for a few minutes, something that might have been peace settled on her. That night, she sent a message over the telegraph lines that now connected almost every part of the empire. From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them. She meant it. She had always meant what she said, even when what she said was inconvenient or unpopular or wrong. This was always true, and it was, in the end, what people felt about her, that she was real, that behind the black dress and the crown and the immense accumulated weight of the institution, there was a person, vivid and particular and stubbornly herself, who had been genuinely trying for 60 years to do what she had said she would do at the age of 13. I will be good, she had tried. And now the city of London was telling her, in the only way cities can tell individuals things, that it had noticed the South African War, the Boer War, cast a shadow over the final years that even the Jubilee's light could not entirely dispel. The war began in October 1899, when two small Boer republics in southern Africa went to war against the British Empire. Rather than accept British supremacy, everyone expected it to be over quickly. It was not. The Boers were brilliant guerrilla fighters. The British Army was ill prepared for the kind of warfare they encountered, and the first months brought a series of military reverses that shook the confidence of a nation not accustomed to losing. Victoria was 80 years old when the war began, and she threw herself into it with an energy that alarmed her doctors. She demanded daily reports. She pored over maps. She visited the wounded at military hospitals and spoke to them individually, learning their names, asking about their families, conveying the kind of personal attention that only very old women of great determination can convincingly maintain in a hospital ward. She sent chocolate to the troops at Christmas, 100,000 tins of it, each tin embossed with her portrait. When the war went badly, she refused with magnificent stubbornness to allow anyone in her presence to discuss the possibility of defeat. Please understand, she is reported to have said to a household official who had made the mistake of observing that things look difficult, that there is no depression in this house, and we are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist. In April 1900, at the age of 80, she made the extraordinary decision to forgo her annual holiday in the south of France and go instead to Ireland, which had provided a disproportionate number of volunteers for the army. She stayed in Dublin for 3 weeks, driving through the streets without an armed escort, against the advice of everyone responsible for her safety. And the visit was a complete and genuine success. The Irish crowds cheered her with an enthusiasm that surprised even the optimists in her household. She came home having demonstrated, as she had so often demonstrated, that she understood the symbolic importance of simply showing up. But the visit had cost her something. Those who traveled with her noticed for the first time a fatigue that was different from the ordinary tiredness of an old woman who has worked hard. Something had been given this time that could not quite be replenished. In the summer of 1900, her memory began to slip in ways she was aware of and found deeply distressing. There were moments of aphasia, words that should have come failing to arrive. Her eyesight had worsened to the point that reading without assistance was almost impossible. She was not in any specific way ill. No single identifiable disease had declared itself. But those around her and she herself could see that the general decline that had been theoretical for so long was now concrete and accelerating. She continued working. This is worth saying clearly, because it is remarkable. Victoria, in the last year of her life, maintained a correspondence and a schedule that would have exhausted people 30 years younger. She wrote letters to the families of men who had been killed in South Africa. She received ministers and ambassadors. She attended to her boxes. She had always worked in the way that people of genuine duty work, not because it was pleasant, but because it was necessary. And she continued working until it was physically impossible to continue. On the 14th of January, 1901, she received Lord Roberts, who had just returned victorious from South Africa. She questioned him for an hour about every detail of the campaign. She appeared to sustain the effort. When he left, she collapsed. The next day, her doctors, looking at her with the calm objectivity of people whose professional responsibility requires them to say what they see, recognized that she was dying. Her family gathered at Osborne. They came by train and by ship from across England and Europe. Her children came, the ones still living: Edward, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Beatrice. Their children came, or as many as could get there quickly. Her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, came with a haste and a genuine anguish that surprised those who expected political calculation. He loved his grandmother, fiercely and simply, in the way grandsons sometimes love their grandmothers, in the manner in which he came to her bedside and held her with his one good arm while she was dying, was one of the more purely human moments in that room full of history. For 2 more days after the doctor's verdict, Victoria continued. She still recognized faces. She still occasionally spoke. She was still, even now, herself, imperious and direct in her moments of clarity, sinking into something quiet and far away in the moments between. And then, on the 22nd of January, 1901, at 6:30 in the evening, she died. The grief that swept through the country when the news was made public had a quality that the people who experienced it found difficult to describe afterwards. It was not simply the grief of subjects for a monarch. It was something more personal than that, more disoriented. The vast majority of British subjects had never known any other sovereign. Victoria had been on the throne for 63 years and 7 months. She had become, in the most literal possible sense, an indissoluble part of their world. She had been reigning before their parents were born, in many cases. She was the thing that did not change, in a century of relentless, dizzying change. And now she was gone. She was buried at Windsor in the white dress she had asked to be buried in. Her wedding veil was placed over her face, just as she had requested. In her right hand, placed there by her doctor as she was dying, was the ring Albert had put on her finger 61 years before, on the morning of their wedding. In her left hand, hidden carefully beneath beneath flowers so that the ladies dressing her would not see and be surprised, was a plaster cast of Albert's hand. Next to her heart, placed there by her own instruction, was a lock of John Brown's hair and photographs of Brown and his brother. A diamond bracelet from Albert was clasped on her wrist. She had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and she had governed it for longer than anyone before or since. She had sat on the throne when Wellington was still alive, and Dickens was writing novels, and the railway was a new invention, and she was still on it when wireless telegraphy existed, and the internal combustion engine existed, and the world was becoming something that would have been unrecognizable to the young woman who had walked into that Privy Council chamber alone in the summer of 1837 in a plain black dress. She had been, in the course of her reign, passionately loved and viciously mocked. She had been stubborn to the point of absurdity and courageous beyond anything that was required of her. She had been a devoted wife who suffered enormously in the loss of her husband, and a devoted mother who drove her children half to distraction with the intensity of her attention. She had been an autocrat in a constitutional monarchy, which was an arrangement that should not have worked, and somehow did. She had been, by turns, glorious and petty and magnificent and small and everything in between. And she had never, not once, not for a single moment, tried to be anything other than exactly what she was. She had said, at 13 years old, looking at the page that showed her how close she stood to the crown, "I will be good." She kept her word, and the world has never quite forgotten it.